In January 2009, Zimbabwe printed a banknote with more zeros than you can count on two hands. $100 trillion on a single piece of paper, and it couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Actually, that's not quite right. When the bill was issued, you could buy bread if you could find a bakery that was open, and if you got there before the price doubled, because by the time you walked from the bank to the store, the bread cost twice as much. By the time you got to the front of the line, it had doubled again. Bakers were repricing bread every hour, not because they were greedy, because by closing time, the money from the morning sales couldn't buy flour for tomorrow.
This is the story of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, the second worst currency collapse in recorded history. At its peak, prices doubled every single day. Not every month, not every week, every 24 hours. People stopped counting in money. They counted in eggs. How many eggs does this cost? A teacher's monthly salary? 3 eggs. A year's rent? Maybe a dozen eggs. The entire economy ran on barter, because cash had become a joke.
But Zimbabwe wasn't always like this. 30 years earlier, Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of Africa. It exported food to its neighbors. It had one of the continent's strongest currencies. Economists predicted it would become Southern Africa's economic engine, the next South Africa. So how does a country with everything collapse so completely? How do you destroy a currency so thoroughly that people wallpaper their homes with trillion-dollar bills? Welcome to the autopsy of Zimbabwe's economy. Every hyperinflation has a cause of death. This one has a name: Robert Mugabe. To understand Zimbabwe's death, you need to understand its birth. Before 1980, Zimbabwe didn't exist. The land was called Rhodesia, a white minority-ruled state that had declared independence from Britain. For 15 years, a brutal guerrilla war raged between the white government and black liberation movements. In 1980, the war ended. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe became prime minister. And for a brief shining moment, it looked like everything might actually work. The new Zimbabwe had been blessed with gifts most African nations could only dream of: fertile land that could grow anything, gold and platinum underground, diamonds in the rivers, a population that could read and write. Literacy rates were among the highest on the continent, infrastructure that actually functioned, roads, railways, electricity that worked more often than it didn't. And most importantly, Zimbabwe had farms. Massive commercial operations, thousands of acres of organized modern agriculture. These farms produced tobacco that Europe wanted, maize that fed the region, beef that commanded premium prices. Yes, those farms were owned by white farmers, a legacy of colonial land theft. The distribution was grossly unfair, but economically, those farms were the engine that made everything else possible. They employed hundreds of thousands of workers. They generated the foreign currency Zimbabwe needed to import fuel, medicine, machinery. They were the foundation. Through the 1980s, Zimbabwe's economy grew steadily. The currency was strong, stronger than the US dollar at times. Harare, the capital, was clean and modern. Tourists came for Victoria Falls and the wildlife. International investors were interested. Mugabe, despite being a Marxist revolutionary, governed pragmatically at first. He kept the white farmers in place. He invited foreign investment. He built schools and clinics. Literacy rates climbed even higher, but beneath the surface, rot was spreading. Mugabe's government was corrupt. His party, ZANU-PF, operated like a patronage machine. Government jobs went to loyalists. Contracts went to cronies. State-owned companies became piggy banks for politicians. The civil service ballooned with people who showed up for paychecks, not work. And Mugabe never forgot he was a liberation hero. He'd fought the white regime. He'd brought independence. In his mind, he'd earned the right to rule forever. Anyone who opposed him wasn't a political rival. They were a traitor to the revolution. In the late 80s, Mugabe changed the constitution to give himself more power. He absorbed rival parties. He crushed opposition. The checks and balances that might have constrained him quietly disappeared. By the 90s, the cracks were widening. The economy slowed. Unemployment crept upward. The budget deficit grew because Mugabe kept spending on his supporters, government salaries, military toys, patronage that kept people loyal. But tax revenue couldn't keep up. Then Mugabe made a catastrophic mistake. In the late 90s, he announced pensions for Liberation War veterans, huge payouts for tens of thousands of people. The program would cost billions, money the government didn't have. So the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe did what desperate governments always do. They printed it. The currency crashed overnight. A single day in late 1997 saw the Zimbabwe dollar lose nearly 3/4 of its value. It was a warning shot, a sign that the currency was already dying. But Mugabe wasn't paying attention. He was about to kill it completely. By the turn of the millennium, Mugabe had been in power for 2 decades. The economy was stagnating. Unemployment was crushing. His popularity was collapsing. He needed a scapegoat. He found one: the white farmers. In 2000, Mugabe held a referendum to expand his presidential powers. The people voted no. It was the first time Zimbabweans had rejected him. The loss came from urban areas and from commercial farming regions, where workers had voted against him. Mugabe's response was revenge disguised as justice. He launched what he called fast-track land reform. Officially, it was about correcting colonial injustice, redistributing land to landless black Zimbabweans. In reality, it was political violence dressed up as social justice. Starting in 2000, government-backed militias calling themselves war veterans invaded white-owned farms. They came with weapons. They beat farmers. They burned crops. They killed workers. The police stood by and watched. The army did nothing. When courts issued orders protecting farmers, Mugabe simply ignored them. Over the next several years, nearly every white commercial farmer was driven off their land. Some were murdered. Most fled to neighboring countries, Zambia, Mozambique, South Africa, taking their expertise and their capital with them. And here's what made it all a lie. The land didn't go to landless peasants. It went to Mugabe's friends. Government ministers, army generals, party officials. They got the best farms. Most had never farmed in their lives. Many didn't even live on the land. They just wanted the asset, something valuable to own. The agricultural collapse was immediate and catastrophic. The farms that once fed southern Africa fell silent. Maize production collapsed. Tobacco exports, Zimbabwe's biggest earner, nearly vanished. Wheat production died. Within a few years, the country that once fed its neighbors couldn't feed itself. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe was importing food. The United Nations was running famine relief operations. Millions of Zimbabweans, a third of the population, survived on international food aid. The hundreds of thousands of farm workers lost everything. No job, no income, no school for their children, no clinic when someone got sick. The farms had been entire economic ecosystems. When they died, everything around them died too. Then the foreign currency dried up. Zimbabwe's exports collapsed. No exports meant no dollars or euros or pounds coming in. Without foreign currency, Zimbabwe couldn't import fuel, medicine, machinery, spare parts. Factories shut down. Hospitals ran out of drugs. Gas stations ran dry. The government's revenue collapsed, but Mugabe's spending didn't stop. He still had a military to pay. He still had cronies expecting their cut. He still needed to buy loyalty. So the Reserve Bank did the only thing it could. It printed money. When you destroy your economy's productive capacity, you're left with three choices. 1. Cut spending dramatically. Fire government workers. Stop the subsidies. Accept a painful recession. 2. Borrow money. Go to the IMF. Accept their conditions. Restructure everything. 3. Print money. Create currency out of thin air and pretend everything's fine. Mugabe chose option 3. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, run by a Mugabe loyalist named Gideon Gano, became a money printing operation. They literally imported printing presses from Germany and ran them around the clock. At first, the inflation seemed manageable, high but survivable, uncomfortable but not catastrophic. Then it started accelerating. Each year, inflation climbed higher. Each year, the Reserve Bank printed more. Each year, the spiral tightened. And here's the thing about inflation. Once it starts, it feeds itself. The government prints money to cover its spending. That increases the money supply. Prices rise. Workers demand higher wages. Businesses raise prices to cover the higher wages. The government needs more money to pay higher salaries. So it prints more, which causes more inflation, which causes more price increases, which causes more printing. It's a death spiral. And once you're in it, there's no easy way out. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe was printing new currency denominations just to keep up. $1,000 notes, then 10,000, then 100,000, then million. The numbers kept climbing, and people adapted. If you got paid on Friday, you spent everything by Sunday, because by Monday your salary would be worth half as much. Saving money? Pointless. Planning for the future? Impossible. The entire economy ran on immediate spending, because every hour your money lost value. Meanwhile, Mugabe kept spending as if nothing was wrong. He sent troops to fight a pointless war in the Congo. He bought fighter jets the Air Force didn't need. He built mansions for himself and his friends. All of it funded by printing money. All of it driving inflation higher. By the late 2000s, inflation had crossed into 4 digits. Prices were doubling every month, then every week. ATMs ran out of cash every morning. People queued for hours to withdraw their daily limit, which by the time they got home couldn't buy dinner. Economists define hyperinflation as inflation exceeding 50% per month. By that definition, Zimbabwe entered hyperinflation in early 2007. By late 2008, prices were doubling every single day. Let me put that in perspective. A loaf of bread that cost $1 billion Zimbabwe dollars on Monday cost $2 billion on Tuesday, $4 billion on Wednesday, $8 billion on Thursday. Restaurants repriced menus between lunch and dinner. Gas stations changed prices every hour. Shopkeepers wrote prices in chalk so they could erase and update them constantly. People stopped using calculators. The numbers were too big to fit on the screen. They stopped using cash registers. What's the point of recording a sale in a currency that's worthless an hour later? The Reserve Bank kept printing higher denominations, $1,000,000 notes, then 10 million, 100 million, billion, 10 billion, and then came the big ones. In mid-2008, the Reserve Bank issued a $100 billion note, then trillion-dollar notes, 10 trillion, 20 trillion, 50 trillion, and finally in January 2009, the note that would make Zimbabwe infamous, $100 trillion. It was the second highest denomination currency ever printed in human history, and it couldn't buy 3 eggs. People would withdraw their entire daily limit from the ATM. $100 trillion walk to the grocery store and buy maybe 3 eggs. That was it. Your entire life savings in the bank, 3 eggs. The bills became worthless faster than they could be printed. The Reserve Bank tried slashing zeros off the currency. They'd remove 3 zeros and issue new money. Didn't work. They removed 10 zeros. Didn't work. Prices just adjusted upward immediately. The formal economy collapsed entirely. Factories shut down. They couldn't afford inputs. Shops closed. There was nothing to sell. Even when goods appeared, they were priced in US dollars or South African rand, not Zimbabwe dollars. Cash transactions happened under the table. The informal economy took over. Street traders, barter markets, currency speculators, updating exchange rates by the hour. People with US dollars became kings. People with only Zimbabwe dollars became beggars. In 2008, Zimbabwe had a cholera outbreak. Tens of thousands of people got sick. Thousands died. Cholera is a disease of poverty. It spreads through dirty water. It's easily preventable. All you need is clean water and basic sanitation. It's easily treatable. Rehydration salts cost pennies. But Zimbabwe's water treatment plants had shut down. The government couldn't afford to import treatment chemicals. Foreign suppliers wouldn't accept Zimbabwe dollars. So the water stopped being treated. And people started dying from something that should have been eradicated decades ago. The hospitals couldn't help. No medicine, no supplies, no fuel for ambulances. Most doctors and nurses had fled to South Africa or Botswana, where they could actually get paid. This is what hyperinflation does. It doesn't just destroy money. It destroys everything money makes possible. Healthcare, education, infrastructure, hope. By 2008, almost no one had a formal job. The economy was dead. Only a tiny fraction of Zimbabweans could find work. Everyone else survived through informal trading, subsistence farming, or money sent by relatives who'd escaped abroad. Life expectancy collapsed. In the 90s, Zimbabweans lived into their 60s. By the late 2000s, life expectancy had dropped to the 40s. People were dying young from preventable diseases, from malnutrition, from a healthcare system that had ceased to exist. Schools shut down. Teachers stopped showing up because their salaries couldn't buy food. Parents couldn't afford fees. By 2008, only a fraction of children were attending school regularly. An entire generation's education was being stolen. The middle class was destroyed. People who'd spent their lives building savings, buying homes, planning for retirement, all of it evaporated overnight. A pension that should have supported someone for years became worthless in a day. Life savings vanished, and people fled. Millions of Zimbabweans, perhaps a quarter of the entire population, left the country. They went to South Africa, Botswana, the UK, anywhere that would take them. Doctors, teachers, engineers, skilled workers. The country's human capital drained away. The ones who stayed resorted to desperate measures. Crime exploded. Families survived on 1 meal a day, if they were lucky. People scavenged in garbage dumps for anything to sell or eat. And through it all, Mugabe didn't care. While his people starved, he threw lavish birthday parties for himself. While hospitals had no medicine, he flew to Singapore for medical treatment. While children died of cholera, he built another mansion. Hyperinflation wasn't just an economic failure, it was a crime. In January 2009, the Reserve Bank issued that infamous $100 trillion note. When it came out, it could buy maybe 3 eggs. Or a loaf of bread if you could find one. By the time people actually got the notes from banks, they couldn't even buy that. The bills became collector's items. Tourists bought them as souvenirs, exotic reminders of economic disaster. People used them as wallpaper, as bookmarks. There are photos of children playing with stacks of trillion-dollar bills like Monopoly money, building towers that would have bought houses a decade earlier. The absurdity was complete. Zimbabwe had printed its currency into irrelevance. So in April 2009, Zimbabwe did something unprecedented. It abandoned its own currency. The government officially allowed foreign currencies to be used for all transactions. US dollars, South African rand, Botswana pula, anything except Zimbabwe dollars. The Zimbabwe dollar ceased to be legal tender in its own country. Dollarization wasn't a policy choice. It was an admission of defeat. The government had destroyed the currency so completely that it was easier to just use other people's money. Overnight, the hyperinflation stopped. Prices stabilized. Shops restocked. Markets reopened. People could plan again. If you had US dollars, you could buy things. If you had Zimbabwe dollars, you had wallpaper. But the damage was permanent. Dollarization fixed the inflation immediately. When you can't print US dollars, you can't create inflation. But it created a new problem. Zimbabwe no longer controlled its own monetary policy. The government was broke. It had no dollars, it couldn't pay civil servants, it couldn't import fuel or medicine. For the first time in decades, it had to run something close to a balanced budget because it couldn't print money to cover the gap. The economy stabilized, but it didn't recover. Growth was weak. Unemployment stayed crushingly high. The agricultural sector never came back. Those seized farms never became productive again. The infrastructure kept crumbling. The brain drain continued. Mugabe stayed in power until 2017. After 37 years, his own party finally forced him out. He was replaced by Emerson Mnangagwa, Mugabe's former deputy. Same party, same corruption, same system. And then, incredibly, they tried to bring back the Zimbabwe dollar. In 2019, the government issued a new currency. They banned foreign currencies again. They claimed this time would be different. It wasn't. Within months, inflation returned. By 2020, it had climbed back into triple digits. The new Zimbabwe dollar collapsed just like the old one. People refused to accept it. The black market for US dollars roared back to life. By late 2020, they gave up again. Foreign currencies were re-allowed. The new Zimbabwe dollar joined the old one in the graveyard of failed currencies. As of today, Zimbabwe still uses US dollars and South African rand. The Zimbabwe dollar exists on paper, but nobody uses it. Nobody trusts it. Nobody wants it. The economy remains broken. Unemployment is still massive. The farms are still unproductive. The brain drain continues. Millions of Zimbabweans still live abroad, sending money home to keep their families alive. Mugabe died in 2019 in a hospital in Singapore. The same healthcare system he'd destroyed for his own people was the one that treated him until the end. Zimbabwe remains a warning, a country that had everything and destroyed it through the most predictable economic suicide in modern history. So why does this keep happening? Zimbabwe isn't unique. Argentina, Venezuela, Weimar Germany, Hungary, Yugoslavia, hyperinflation has struck dozens of countries, and the pattern is always exactly the same. Here's the formula. Step 1. Destroy your productive capacity. Zimbabwe seized the farms. Venezuela nationalized the oil companies. Weimar Germany lost its industrial base in war reparations. You kill the part of your economy that creates wealth. Step 2. Keep spending anyway. Mugabe kept paying his cronies and his military. Chavez kept funding his social programs. You refuse to cut spending even though the money's not coming in. Step 3. Refuse to borrow or accept austerity. Mugabe wouldn't go to the IMF. Maduro wouldn't accept reforms. You won't do the hard things that might actually fix the problem. Step 4. Print money to cover the gap. The Reserve Bank prints. The central bank prints. You create money out of thin air. Step 5. Inflation starts and accelerates. Prices rise. People lose confidence. They spend money immediately. The currency velocity increases. Inflation feeds on itself. Step 6. The currency dies. Hyperinflation. Dollarization. Barter. The money becomes worthless. The economy collapses. Every single time, it's the same pattern. And every single time, the government insists it won't happen to them. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation was completely predictable. When you destroy productive farms, your exports die. When your exports die, you have no foreign currency. When you have no foreign currency, you can't import what you need. When you can't import inputs, your factories close. When your factories close, your tax revenue collapses. When revenue collapses but spending doesn't, you print money. When you print money, you get inflation. When you print enough money, you get hyperinflation. Every economist in the world saw it coming. The IMF warned them. Neighboring countries warned them. Mugabe's own advisors warned him. He didn't care, because hyperinflation isn't an economic mistake. It's a political choice. Mugabe chose to destroy the currency rather than admit his land reform was a disaster. He chose to print money rather than cut spending on his cronies. He chose inflation rather than accept that he was wrong. And millions of Zimbabweans paid the price. Here's the uncomfortable truth. It can happen anywhere. Zimbabwe had unique factors. The land seizures, Mugabe's dictatorship. But the underlying mechanism is universal. If a government destroys its productive capacity, refuses to cut spending, and prints money to cover the gap, hyperinflation is inevitable. Always. Could it happen in a developed country? Maybe. It happened in Germany after World War I. It nearly happened in several countries in the 70s and 80s. Developed countries have advantages: independent central banks, stronger institutions, diversified economies, access to borrowing. But the temptation is always there. When governments face crises, pandemics, wars, recessions, the easy answer is printing money, stimulus packages, quantitative easing, deficit spending. Most countries manage it responsibly, some don't. Zimbabwe is the warning. It shows what happens when printing becomes the solution to every problem. It shows how fast confidence can evaporate. It shows that once hyperinflation starts, it's nearly impossible to stop without destroying the currency completely. And it shows that the people who suffer most are never the politicians. Mugabe lived in Manchester pensions and died comfortably. Gideon Gano retired with a pension. The party elites kept their farms and their offshore accounts. The people who lost everything were teachers, farmers, workers, retirees, ordinary people who had no choice but to hold Zimbabwe dollars because they had nothing else. Hyperinflation is theft, a crime against savers, a destruction of trust that takes generations to rebuild. Zimbabwe's $100 trillion bill isn't just a curiosity, it's a tombstone. So what's the cause of death? Patient. Zimbabwe dollar. Cause of death. Self-inflicted money printing. Primary symptoms. Land seizures. Government spending without revenue. Loss of productive capacity. Terminal event. Hyperinflation reaching incomprehensible levels. Time of death. April 2009, when Zimbabwe gave up on its own currency. Prognosis. Dead. Revival attempted. Failed immediately. Unlikely to return. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation was the second worst in recorded history. It lasted longer than most. It destroyed more completely. And the lesson is brutally simple. You can't print your way to prosperity. You can only print your way to ruin. Zimbabwe proved it. Venezuela proved it. Argentina keeps proving it. The formula for hyperinflation is well known. The warning signs are obvious. The outcome is inevitable. The only question is whether governments will learn, or whether the next autopsy is already being written. This is Financial History Autopsy. Every collapse has a cause of death. Subscribe for more.